For nearly 2.5 hours, Goodfellas lets the audience fall in love with a world and then hands them a single rat to ride alongside. Henry Hill walks into a federal building near the end, sits down with the government, and the film treats it as the one unthinkable act, the breaking of the only rule that ever mattered. Hollywood made his betrayal feel singular, a desperate man with nothing left to lose, choosing survival over loyalty in a world where loyalty was supposed to be sacred. The men that story was built around tell a different version. Joe Valachi cracked the silence on national television 17 years before Hill ever flipped. Gregory Scarpa murdered for 30 years while drawing an FBI paycheck. An agent named Joseph Pistone lived as a wise guy for 6 years and nearly became a made man. An underboss traded 19 murders for 5 years and a brand new name. What you are about to hear is the informant world the film refused to show, and it runs far deeper than one man standing in a bathrobe. Section 1. The one rat Goodfellas let you see. For most of its running time, Goodfellas feels like a film made by someone who was there, because in a sense it was. The story comes from Henry Hill, told first to the writer Nicholas Pileggi and turned into the 1985 book Wise Guy, then handed to Martin Scorsese and turned into the film 5 years later. Everything the audience sees is filtered through one man's memory and one man's vantage point. Hill was an associate of the Lucchese crime family in New York, never a made member because his father was Irish, but trusted enough to spend roughly 25 years moving through the edges of that world. He watched the dinners and the scores and the killings from a particular seat at the table, and the film keeps that seat fixed for the entire picture. That single vantage point is the film's great strength and its quiet limitation at the same time. When the story arrives at its turning point, the audience experiences Hill's cooperation as something almost unique, a private betrayal committed by a desperate man with no remaining options. The film earns that feeling. By 1980, Hill was caught in a narcotics case, watching the people around him die. Convinced that Jimmy Burke was already working through the men connected to the Lufthansa robbery and that his own name was somewhere on that list. He had reason to believe it. Federal prosecutors arrested him as a material witness, and his choices had narrowed to 2 grim outcomes, both ending with him dead, one in prison and one on the street. Hill made his move first. On the 27th of May in 1980, he signed an agreement to cooperate with the United States Department of Justice Organized Crime Strike Force. And from that day forward, he belonged to the government rather than to the Lucchese family. What followed was not a single dramatic courtroom scene of the kind films prefer. It was years of debriefings, of building cases, of sitting across from prosecutors, and giving up the men he had known since childhood. Sources covering his cooperation put the result at roughly 50 convictions. Among the men his testimony helped send to prison were Paul Vario, the capo who had been something close to a second father to him, and Jimmy Burke, the figure rendered on screen with such cold charisma. The warmth of the early scenes and the cooperation that came later belonged to the same man, separated only by time and fear. The film carries that arc faithfully, and then it stops. Goodfellas ends with Hill in a bathrobe outside a suburban house, resentful that his new anonymous life is dull, that the food is bad, that he has become an average nobody. The picture frames his diminishment as the price of betrayal, the closing note of a man who gave up everything and got a witness protection assignment in return. What the film cannot show, because Hill's knowledge ended where the film ends, is that his story was one small thread inside a vastly larger pattern, a pattern that had been forming for decades and would keep widening for decades more. The informant system that ran through the American Mafia was not built around Henry Hill, and it did not begin or end with him. By the time he signed his agreement in 1980, the federal government had already spent close to 20 years cultivating sources inside the families. Made men had been talking, capos had been talking, In at least one case, a high-ranking gangster had been feeding the government information since the early 1960s, while continuing to commit murder. There was an entire program devoted to developing these sources, an entire protection apparatus devoted to keeping them alive, and an entire history of men who had broken the code long before Hill ever considered it. None of that appears in the film, because none of it was visible from where Hill sat. What the film gives the audience is a single keyhole into a house with many rooms. Through that keyhole, the view is sharp and honest, and often beautiful. The clothes are right, the rhythms of speech are right. The texture of the life is rendered with a care that the real figures behind the production reportedly confirmed. The keyhole simply does not show the rest of the structure. It does not show the men who informed for money, or for revenge, or out of pure calculation. It does not show the agent who became a wise guy, or the underboss who detonated the entire code, or the killer the FBI kept on its books while he buried bodies across Brooklyn. The film chose its one rat and followed him home. The record contains many more, and their stories are stranger and darker than the one the camera was willing to enter. Henry Hill was the one informant the film let the audience meet, and his cooperation arrived as a private collapse rather than part of a system. That system was already old by 1980, and to find its beginning, the story has to go back nearly 2 decades. To a frightened soldier in a prison yard who became the first man ever to say the words out loud. Section 2. The Man Who Spoke First. For most of the 20th century, the American Mafia protected itself with something far stronger than guns. It protected itself with silence. The rule had a name, omerta, and it held that a member never spoke about the organization to an outsider, never admitted the thing existed, never gave a name to a policeman or a prosecutor, no matter what it cost him. For decades, that silence worked so completely that the federal government could not prove in any courtroom that a national crime organization existed at all. The man who ran the FBI spent years denying the idea outright. The wall held because every man standing behind it had agreed to die before he would crack it. The first real crack came from a heavy-set, aging soldier in the Genovese crime family named Joseph Valachi. Valachi was born in 1904 and became a made member of the Mafia around 1930, which meant that by the early 1960s, he had spent more than 30 years inside the life. He was never a boss or anything close to one. He was a soldier, a man who earned through small rackets and took orders and stayed quiet. The kind of figure who normally lives and dies without the public ever learning his name. What lifted him out of that obscurity was a sequence of fear, paranoia, and one terrible mistake made inside a federal prison. In the early 1960s, Valachi was serving time in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, and one of his fellow inmates was Vito Genovese, the powerful boss of the family Valachi belonged to. Genovese came to suspect, wrongly, that Valachi had become an informer. Inside that world, a suspicion held by a boss was close to a death sentence, and Genovese is said to have given Valachi the gesture the Mafia used to mark a man for death. Valachi understood what it meant. He believed, from that moment, that the organization had decided he was going to be killed, and he began watching every man around him as a potential assassin. In June of 1962, that fear turned into violence. Valachi, convinced that a particular inmate had been sent to murder him, attacked the man with a length of steel pipe and beat him to death. The man he killed had nothing to do with any plot against him. It was a case of mistaken identity, a killing born entirely of panic, and it left Valachi facing the possibility of the death penalty for a murder committed inside a federal prison, cornered on every side, with his own organization wanting him dead, and the government holding a capital case over him. Valachi made the decision that no made man before him had ever made in public. He decided to talk, and he decided to do it where the whole country could watch. In 1963, Valachi testified before a United States Senate subcommittee on organized crime led by Senator John McClellan. He was guarded by roughly 200 federal marshals, a measure of how seriously the government took the rumors that the mafia had placed a price of $100,000 on his head. Sources describe him as the first person in the country offered government protection in exchange for his testimony, a quiet beginning of an idea that would later grow into a formal protection program. Over a series of televised appearances, millions of ordinary people watched a member of the mafia sit at a table and describe, in plain and patient detail, the organization that the government had struggled for years to even name. What Valachi gave was not a stack of cases against specific bosses. His disclosures did not by themselves send many of the high-ranking leaders to prison. What he gave was something arguably more lasting. He laid out the structure of the organization, the bosses and underbosses and capos and soldiers, the division of New York into 5 families, the existence of a commission that managed disputes among them. He described the ritual by which a man became a made member. He named active and former members across the families. He gave the public and the investigators a map of a world that had, until then, existed only as rumor. He is widely credited with putting the term Cosa Nostra, the words the members themselves used for the life, into the American vocabulary. The Attorney General at the time, Robert Kennedy, described the testimony as the single largest intelligence breakthrough yet achieved against organized crime in the country. The man behind the testimony did not enjoy any reward worth the name. Valachi spent his remaining years in custody. He wrote out a long account of his life by hand while imprisoned, and the journalist Peter Maas drew on it to produce a best-selling book in 1968 that carried the Valachi story to an even wider audience, later adapted into a film starring Charles Bronson. Valachi himself died in prison in 1971 of a heart attack, an old man who had broken the most important rule of his world and had gained almost nothing personal from breaking it. His importance to the larger story is in the timing. Henry Hill signed his cooperation agreement in 1980. Valachi had cracked the wall of silence 17 years earlier, in front of television cameras, with the entire country watching. By the time the film treats Hill's decision as a singular and unprecedented betrayal, the precedent had been set for nearly 2 decades. A made man could talk. A made man could survive talking, at least for a while, under heavy guard. The code that the mafia held up as unbreakable had already been broken in the most public way imaginable, and the government had learned a lesson it would never forget. Men on the inside could be turned, and once turned, they could be used. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Valachi proved that the wall of silence could be breached, and that a frightened insider could be turned into a witness. What the government did next was to stop waiting for frightened men to come forward and start building a quiet machine designed to create informants, on purpose, deep inside the families, years before anyone was ever arrested. Section 3. The Secret Machine for Turning Made Men. The story of how the government learned to grow its own informants begins not with a gangster, but with a traffic of expensive cars on a country road in upstate New York. In November of 1957, a state trooper named Edgar Croswell noticed an unusual gathering of luxury vehicles outside the rural estate of a man named Joseph Barbara, near the small town of Appalachian. What he had stumbled onto was a national meeting of mafia leaders, dozens of bosses and high-ranking figures who had traveled from across the country to confer in what they believed was complete privacy. The meeting scattered the moment the police arrived, with powerful men in fine suits running through the woods, and the spectacle landed in newspapers everywhere. The embarrassment of Appalachian was enormous, and it fell hardest on the FBI. For years, the Bureau and the man who led it had downplayed the idea of a coordinated national crime syndicate, and now the existence of one had been exposed by a single observant trooper. The pressure to respond was immediate. In the aftermath, The director instituted an effort aimed at developing information about prominent criminal leaders and their activities, an early program built around the goal of learning who these men were and how they operated. The Bureau began, slowly, to turn its enormous resources toward the organization it had spent so long declining to name. That early effort grew into something more deliberate and more secretive over the next several years. By 1961, the director had formally launched a program devoted to cultivating high-level confidential sources inside criminal organizations, a program that came to be known as the Top Echelon Informant Program. The logic behind it marked a shift in strategy. Rather than waiting for frightened men like Valachi to come forward after a crisis, the Bureau would actively seek out and develop informants on purpose. Ideally, men placed high enough inside the families to know what the bosses knew. Field agents across the country received instruction to be constantly alert for the development of new informants and new potential sources. And the quality of those sources became a measure of an office's work. The mechanics of cultivating such a source were patient and methodical. An agent assigned to organized crime would study the membership of a particular family, learning the names, the relationships, the rivalries, and above all the points of weakness. A made man who had recently been arrested and faced a long sentence was a candidate. A man who had been humiliated by his captain, passed over for promotion, or cheated out of money he believed he was owed was a candidate. A man with a sick relative and mounting bills, or a gambling debt he could not cover, was a candidate. The approach itself was often slow and indirect, a relationship built over months, sometimes over years, until a man who would never have walked into a federal building of his own accord found himself quietly feeding information to a handler he met in a parked car or a diner on the far side of the city. What the men who agreed to this arrangement received in return was protection of a particular, limited kind. Some were paid. Some were maneuvering to use the Bureau against their own competitors inside the underworld, feeding the government cases against the very men who stood between them and more power. Some had simply calculated that the odds had turned against the organization and that survival meant having a relationship with the people who would eventually take it apart. The handlers, for their part, had to sort through these tangled motives and decide what each source was worth, how far his protection should extend, and how much of his ongoing criminal life the Bureau was willing to overlook in exchange for what he provided. That last question is where the program carried its darkest possibilities, and the record shows the Bureau answered it badly more than once. The arrangement gave informants a measure of shelter from prosecution as long as they kept producing valuable information. And in practice, some handlers extended that shelter far past any defensible limit. In Boston, agents recruited violent men as sources and then looked the other way, while those men continued to deal, steal, and kill, even warning them when other law enforcement agencies were closing in. Decades later, victims and their families brought more than $1 billion in lawsuits against the government over crimes committed by informants, while they operated under FBI protection. The machine built to penetrate the mafia had, in certain offices, become a machine that protected murderers. None of this apparatus appears anywhere in Goodfellas, and that absence is the point. The film renders the world of the families from the inside, where the men at the tables believed their conversations were private and their loyalty was real. Underneath those tables, through every year the film covers, ran a hidden federal effort to recruit the men sitting at them. Some of the figures in any given crew during this period were almost certainly reporting to a handler. The warmth, the trust, the shared meals that the film captures so well were unfolding on top of a structure designed specifically to turn that warmth and trust into evidence. The audience watches a brotherhood. The record shows a brotherhood that the government had been quietly seeding with informants for the better part of 2 decades. The program also produced one figure who stands as the most extreme expression of everything that could go wrong when the Bureau decided a source was too valuable to lose. He was a capo in one of the New York families, a man feared throughout his world for his willingness to kill, and he spent roughly 30 years on the FBI's books while continuing to do exactly that. His handlers protected him. His enemies died. His story is the place where the informant program stops being a clever law enforcement strategy and becomes something much harder to defend. Henry Hill was the one informant the film let the audience meet, but he was a small piece of a machine the FBI had been building since the late 1950s. A machine designed to grow informants inside the families on purpose. The most disturbing thing that machine ever produced was a Colombo capo nicknamed the Grim Reaper, a man who killed for decades while drawing a paycheck from the same bureau hunting his rivals. Section 4. The Grim Reaper on the payroll. In the neighborhoods of Brooklyn that the Colombo crime family controlled, there was a name that carried a particular kind of dread. Gregory Scarpa Sr. was a capo in that family, a man who had risen through the ranks during its violent internal wars, and the people around him understood that he was capable of almost anything. He earned the nickname the Grim Reaper, and a second name, the Killing Machine, and both were taken literally by the men who knew him. He is said to have spoken of one of his victims with a kind of casual hatred, remarking that he would have liked to dig the man up and shoot him a second time. Sources describe a man who took genuine pleasure in killing, and who is believed to have lost track of his own body count somewhere after 50. What none of the men who feared him knew was that the most dangerous figure in their world was also working for the FBI. Scarpa's relationship with the Bureau began in 1962. He was arrested that March on an armed robbery charge, and a conviction would have meant a long prison sentence and the collapse of the criminal operation he had been building. Federal agents offered him the same trade the top echelon program was designed to produce. He could go to prison, or he could provide information about organized crime and walk away. He took the deal without much hesitation, and by the middle of that year he was registered as a top echelon informant. His debriefings were considered valuable enough that accounts describe them reaching the desk of the director himself, and through them the Bureau learned about the structure of the organization, before Valachi ever sat down in front of the Senate cameras. The early years of that relationship produced one of the strangest episodes in the entire history of the program. In 1964, 3 civil rights workers disappeared in Mississippi, murdered by Klansmen, and the search for their bodies became a national priority. According to widely repeated accounts, the FBI turned to Scarpa, a New York mafia killer, and used him to locate the remains by frightening a local Klansman into revealing where they were buried. The details of that story have been disputed over the years and are not settled beyond all argument, so the account is best understood as a reported episode rather than a fully documented one. What it illustrates, regardless, is the kind of man the Bureau had on its books and the kind of work it was willing to consider him for. The arrangement broke down in the mid-1960s over a dispute about money, and for a time, Scarpa and the Bureau went their separate ways. Then, in 1980, a supervisory agent named Lindley DeVecchio decided he wanted Scarpa back. By various accounts, DeVecchio drove to the gangster's home unannounced, locked his car in the driveway, and asked, in effect, to be educated about the life. Scarpa was wary at first, but within a couple of weeks he called, and the relationship resumed. It would run for more than a decade, and it would become far closer than any handler and informant relationship was ever supposed to be. DeVecchio dined with Scarpa at the gangster's home, accepted his hospitality, and grew comfortable in his company in ways that disturbed other agents who saw it happening. Across that decade, Scarpa continued to do exactly what he had always done. He dealt, he loan-sharked, he stole, and he killed, all while drawing the protection that came with being a valued federal source. In roughly 42 years of murder and racketeering, sources note that Scarpa served a total of about 30 days in jail, a figure that captures better than any other how completely his relationship with the government shielded him from the consequences of his life. The relationship reached its most destructive point during the early 1990s, when the Colombo family tore itself apart in a war between two rival factions. The fighting was vicious, with bodies turning up across Brooklyn, and Scarpa threw himself into it with enthusiasm. He is believed to have killed more people during that war than anyone else involved in it. Later allegations went further still and suggested that DeVecchio had fed Scarpa information about his enemies, intelligence that helped the gangster find and murder men on the other side of the conflict. The handler stood accused of helping the informant kill, a charge that would eventually become its own scandal and its own court case. Scarpa's own end came not from a rival's bullet, but from his blood. He had contracted the virus that causes AIDS through a tainted blood transfusion in the late 1980s, and he died of complications from the illness in 1994, in federal custody at last, an aging and sick man rather than a feared capo. The reason his story matters so much to the world Goodfellas built is that it shatters the clean moral shape the film depends on. The film presents informing as the betrayal of something real, a violation committed by men who broke faith with a brotherhood that, for all its violence, contained genuine loyalty and genuine love. Scarpa makes that picture impossible to hold. Here was a made capo, a man at the heart of his family, who had been a rat for 30 years while remaining one of the most prolific killers his world ever produced. He was the most dangerous man in almost any room he entered, and he was an informant the entire time. The film never shows that an informant could be the predator rather than the weakling, the killer rather than the coward. The record shows that the deadliest man in the Colombo family spent 3 decades on the FBI payroll, and that the government protected him while he buried more bodies than anyone around him would ever know. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Gregory Scarpa lived the informant story from the most monstrous angle imaginable, a killer protected by the same bureau hunting his rivals. The opposite extreme of that same world was a man who went the other direction across the line. An FBI agent who walked into the mafia, lived as a wise guy for 6 years, and very nearly became a made man himself. Section 5. The agent who lived as a wise guy. Every informant in this story so far began on the inside. Valachi, Scarpa, and the men the top echelon program cultivated were all members or associates who crossed a line that ran from the criminal world toward the government. In 1976, the FBI tried the opposite. It took one of its own agents and sent him across that same line in the other direction, into the mafia, to live as a gangster for as long as he could survive there. The man chosen for it spent nearly 6 years inside, came closer to becoming a made member than any agent before or since, and emerged with a price on his head that would follow him for the rest of his life. His name was Joseph Pistone. He had joined the FBI in 1969, and he carried qualities that made him almost uniquely suited to the assignment. He was of Italian heritage, fluent in Italian, and he had grown up in a neighborhood in Paterson, New Jersey, where wise guys were a familiar part of the landscape. He understood how these men spoke, how they moved, what they respected, and what they could not abide. The Bureau gave him a new identity. He became Donnie Brasco, a jewel thief, a man with no family ties anyone could check, and a trade that gave him a reason to move in and out of the underworld with goods to sell. The plan was supposed to last about 6 months. It lasted from September of 1976 to July of 1981. Brasco worked his way primarily into the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 New York families. His path ran first through a soldier named Anthony Mira, and then, more importantly, through a hardened older mobster named Benjamin Ruggiero, known as Lefty. Lefty took Brasco on, schooled him in the rules of the life, and vouched for him, which inside that world meant placing his own standing and his own safety behind the younger man. Later, Brasco grew close to a capo named Dominic Napolitano, called Sonny Black, a tough and capable figure who came to trust him and to see him as a genuine confidant. The relationships were, from the mobster's side, completely real. Lefty and Sonny Black believed they were bringing a promising young earner into the family. The daily texture of the life that Pistone experienced was the same machine described earlier in this account, felt from the inside. He followed the tribute structure exactly as a real associate would. By the arrangement he operated under, he kept half of what he earned and passed the rest to Lefty, who in turn split his share with his capo, who passed a portion further up to the Bonanno leadership. Money flowed upward through the hierarchy in precisely the pattern the organization was built around. Pistone even had to convince his own FBI superiors to provide cash at times when there was little information to show for it, because a wise guy who failed to produce drew suspicion. For a long stretch, he did not wear a wire at all. He was with these men daily and nightly, and there was no safe way to carry a recording device through that kind of constant closeness without risking discovery, and discovery meant death. He lived the role around the clock, slept at Sonny Black's apartment, sat through the late-night card games where secrets were traded, and absorbed the rhythms of a world that would have killed him instantly had it understood who he was. The operation moved toward its end during a violent internal conflict inside the Bonanno family in 1981. A faction of rebel capos was maneuvering against the family's leadership, and the dispute was settled the way such disputes usually were. In the spring of that year, 3 of those capos were lured to a meeting and gunned down, an act that ended the brief civil war and that would later be depicted on screen in films about this era. The danger to Pistone rose sharply as the family churned with suspicion and killing. He pushed his superiors to let him remain undercover long enough to actually be made, to take the oath and become a formal member, which would have been an extraordinary intelligence achievement. The Bureau decided the risk had become too great. In the summer of 1981, they shut the operation down, and on a day in late July, Pistone walked away from that world for the last time, having spent the previous days in the company of the very men he had deceived. The results justified the years. Pistone's work led to more than 100 convictions, a blow that reshaped how the FBI thought about fighting organized crime. The Mafia's response was to place a bounty on him, a figure reported at $500,000, an open contract on the agent who had made fools of them by living among them. He would spend years testifying, including against a crime boss and his sons in Milwaukee, and he resigned from the Bureau in 1986. What the Pistone operation reveals about Goodfellas is the angle the film could never take. The film shows the life from inside one man's memory, looking outward at the world he belonged to. Pistone lived the same life from the opposite direction, an outsider who became an insider, and what he learned was that the warmth and the threat the film captures were both completely real and completely inseparable. The friendships were genuine, the danger was genuine. The men who embraced Donnie Brasco as a brother would have killed him without a second thought, had the truth come out. The film never shows that one of the smiling faces at the table could belong to a federal agent, that the government had grown confident enough to plant its own man in the middle of a family. Pistone proved it could be done, and the men who had vouched for him would pay a terrible price for having believed in him. Joe Pistone reversed the informant story, an agent who lived as a gangster for 6 years and nearly became a made man, learning that the warmth and the menace of that world were one and the same. While he was risking his life to get inside, a different kind of breaking point was forming at the very top of another family, where an underboss would soon do something no man of his rank had ever done. Section 6. The underboss who broke the code. The code of silence was supposed to be strongest at the top. A soldier or an associate near the bottom of the hierarchy might break under pressure, might lack the discipline or the stake in the organization to hold the line, and the men above him understood that risk and managed it. The higher a man rose, the more the organization trusted him, the more it bound him, and the more it assumed he would die before he talked. An underboss, the second in command of an entire family, stood among the most committed men in that world. He had taken the oath, sovereigned his rank through years of loyalty and blood, and carried more secrets than almost anyone alive. The idea that such a man would sit down with the government was close to unthinkable. In November of 1991, the underboss of the Gambino crime family did exactly that, and the shock of it ran through the entire American mafia. Salvatore Gravano, known to everyone as Sammy the Bull, had spent his life climbing toward that rank. He carried out his first killing in 1970, working at the time with the Colombo family, and he moved later into the Brooklyn faction of the Gambinos. By the mid-1980s, he had become a serious and feared figure inside that family. In December of 1985, he was part of the crew that murdered the Gambino boss, Paul Castellano, shot down outside a Manhattan steakhouse in a brazen killing planned, and carried out alongside John Gotti and a handful of others. Neither Gotti nor Gravano had sought permission from the commission before removing the head of the family, a violation of the organization's own rules that could have sparked a wider war. It did not. Gotti took control of the Gambinos, and he raised Gravano to underboss, making him the second most powerful man in what was then the most prominent crime family in the country. At the height of his career, Gravano was earning enormous sums, with estimates ranging from several million to as much as $20 million a year. He was rich, feared, and trusted by the boss. What turned him was a combination of federal surveillance and his own cold reading of where it was leading. The FBI had planted listening devices in the places where Gotti and his men met and talked, and the recordings captured a great deal. As Gravano listened to what the government had, and as he absorbed the way Gotti's defense seemed to be shaping up, he came to believe that the boss intended to let him take the fall, to portray him as a violent man whom Gotti had spent years trying to restrain. Gravano concluded that loyalty to Gotti was leading him toward a prison cell, while Gotti walked, and he decided to move first. On the 11th of November in 1991, federal prosecutors announced that Sammy the Bull Gravano had become a cooperating government witness. He was, at that moment, the highest-ranking member of the 5 families ever to break the blood oath and turn. He was only the second confessed underboss of an American crime family to do so, following an earlier defector from the West Coast a little over a decade before. The man who had helped run the Gambino family was now its most dangerous enemy. What Gravano gave the government was devastating in its completeness. He admitted his own involvement in 19 murders, a list that included men he had been close to, among them a friend he had known for years and his own brother-in-law. He sat on the witness stand across 9 days in 1992 and laid out the inner workings of the family, the killings, the rackets, the orders, and above all, the role of John Gotti. The boss had escaped conviction so many times through intimidation and bribery that the press had taken to calling him the Teflon Don. Against Gravano's testimony, the nickname meant nothing. Gotti was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole, and he would die behind bars of cancer years later. Gravano's cooperation helped convict dozens of other mobsters as well. In exchange for all of it, Gravano received a sentence of 5 years, and with the time he had already served, he was a free man not long after. He entered the Witness Protection Program, relocated to Arizona, and took up work in construction under a new identity. For the families of his victims, the arithmetic was unbearable. The father of one murdered man had been killed in a hit Gravano arranged, and his daughter would later speak of the impossibility of accepting that a man who had taken part in 19 killings walked free after so few years. 19 murders, 5 years, was the figure that hung over the entire deal. Gravano's importance to the larger story lies in what his defection told everyone else. When the underboss of the Gambino family turned, the message reached every wise guy in America. The code was no longer something only weak associates broke under pressure. It was now something the second-in-command of the most powerful family in the country would break as a matter of calculation, trading 19 murders for 5 years and a new life in the desert. His cooperation drew a wave of other members toward the same choice, men who looked at what Gravano had received and drew their own conclusions about the value of silence. The dam did not just leak after that. It broke. Goodfellas could never show this. Its informant was a desperate associate who had never been made, a low figure in the hierarchy, with nothing left to lose, breaking as a last act of survival. The film never shows betrayal, arriving from the very top, delivered not in panic, but as a clear-eyed business decision by a man who had everything and chose to keep his freedom instead. The real collapse of the code did not come from the bottom. It came from an underboss who did the math. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Sammy Gravano proved the code could be broken at the very top, and that the reward for breaking it could be freedom in only a handful of years. What the government actually delivered to men who took that deal, the new names and the new towns, was far stranger and far emptier than the film's final image of a man in a bathrobe ever suggested. Section 7. What the government actually promised. When a mafia member agreed to cooperate, he was not simply trading testimony for a shorter sentence. He was trading one entire life for another. The deal that men like Henry Hill and Sammy Gravano signed carried a promise on the other side of it. A promise that the government would keep them alive after they had made themselves the most hated kind of enemy their world recognized. The instrument built to keep that promise was the Federal Witness Protection Program, and what it actually delivered to the men inside it was something far stranger and far emptier than the comfortable ending the film suggests. The roots of the program reach back to Valachi, who in 1963 became the first man offered government protection in exchange for testimony, guarded by a small army of marshals because the organization had put a price on his head. That improvised arrangement showed both the value and the difficulty of keeping a cooperating mobster alive. A formal system did not exist yet, and for several years protection was handled case by case, without consistent rules or resources. In 1970, federal legislation aimed at organized crime established a permanent program, later known as the Witness Security Program, and run through the Department of Justice and the United States Marshals Service. The official, widely credited with designing it, spent years shaping the rules by which a witness and his family could be given new identities, hidden inside ordinary American life. The mechanics were thorough and unforgiving. A protected witness received a new name and a relocation to a city far from the one he had known, often a place with no connection to his past and no one in it who knew his face. The government provided documents to support the new identity, some financial assistance during the transition, and a handler who managed the arrangement. In exchange, the witness had to sever nearly everything that had defined him. He could not contact old friends. He could not return to his old neighborhood. He had to maintain a cover story against everyone he met, including, in many cases, people who grew close to him without ever learning who he truly was. The program could keep a man breathing, and by its own account, it had a strong record of doing so for witnesses who followed its rules. What it could not do was let him remain the person he had been. For the men who had spent their entire adult lives inside the mafia, that erasure was a peculiar kind of punishment. Their identities had been built entirely around a specific community, a specific way of moving through the world, a specific understanding of who mattered and why. The program took all of it. A man who had been known and feared in his neighborhood became a stranger in a quiet town where he had no history and no standing. The skills he had spent decades developing, the knowledge of how to earn through illegal channels, and how to read a room of dangerous men, had no market in his new life. He was safe, and he was no one. Henry Hill experienced this directly. After he entered the program around 1980, he and his family were relocated, moving through more than one state as the government tried to settle them somewhere safe. Hill could not adjust to it. He continued his criminal habits, drew attention, and behaved in ways that compromised the secrecy the program depended on. In 1987, he was thrown out of it, expelled for being unable or unwilling to live by its rules. He spent the rest of his life moving from place to place, looking over his shoulder, half expecting the killing he had always feared. When his death finally came in 2012, it arrived not as a mob hit, but as heart disease in Los Angeles, an ordinary end for a man who had spent decades certain he would die violently. He was 69. Gravano's relationship with the program was no easier, and it failed for different reasons. After his release, he relocated to Arizona and worked in construction under a new name, exactly as the arrangement intended. He could not stay quiet. Within a few years, he was collaborating on a best-selling book about his life in the mafia and giving television interviews, drawing the very attention the program was designed to prevent. By 2000, he had drifted back into crime entirely. Arrested for running a drug ring in Arizona that trafficked in ecstasy, he pleaded guilty and received a long federal sentence, his protected anonymity long since abandoned. The man who had broken the most important deal of his life proved unable to keep the quiet bargain that came afterward. The families absorbed their own version of this erasure, and the film barely registers it. A wife who entered the program with her husband lost her name, her city, her relatives, and the entire web of relationships that had structured her life. Children were uprooted from schools and friends and given new identities they had to learn to inhabit. The community that had once surrounded these families was gone, replaced by a cover story that had to be maintained, day after day, against neighbors and co-workers who could never be told the truth. Goodfellas ends on Hill, standing outside a suburban house in a bathrobe, complaining that his new life is dull and that the food is bad, that he has become an average nobody. The film plays it as bitter comedy, a deflating final note for a man who lost the glamour. The reality the program imposed was heavier than a punchline about bad food. It was the wholesale erasure of a self, a permanent exile from everything a person had been, traded for the bare fact of survival. Hill could not endure it and was expelled. Gravano could not endure it and returned to crime. The promise the government made was real, and it was kept, and it cost the men who accepted it nearly everything that had made them who they were. The Witness program kept cooperators alive by erasing the people they had been, a bargain that Hill could not endure and Gravano could not keep. The men who turned at least chose their fate, but the people who had vouched for them, who placed their own names and their own lives behind a future informant, never got that choice. Section 8. The people who vouched inside the mafia. Vouching for a man was among the most serious things a member could do. When someone brought a new associate into the life, sponsored him, told the others that this man was reliable and could be trusted with the family's business, he was placing his own standing behind that judgment. If the man proved to be a thief, an informant, or a fraud, the responsibility traveled back to whoever had vouched for him. The sponsor had given his word, and in that world, a word given carried the weight of a life. The men who informed made a choice to do so. The men who had vouched for them made no such choice. They had only believed in the wrong person, and for that, they paid prices the film never shows. The clearest example comes from the Donnie Brasco operation. When Joseph Pistone lived inside the Bonanno family as Donnie Brasco, two men in particular staked themselves on him. Benjamin Ruggiero, the soldier called Lefty, took him on and schooled him and vouched for him. The capo Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black, came to trust him deeply, brought him close, and began pushing for Brasco to become a made member, which meant Sonny Black was prepared to sponsor him at the highest level. The trust those men placed in Brasco was real, and it was built over years. They had no idea they were sponsoring a federal agent. When the operation ended in 1981, the FBI went to Sonny Black and revealed the truth, reportedly showing him photographs and making it unmistakable that the man he had vouched for had been an agent the entire time. Sonny Black understood immediately what that meant for him. He had brought an FBI agent into the heart of the family and had been ready to have him made. The responsibility was his, and the organization's rules left only one outcome. In August of 1981, he was summoned to a meeting. He went, apparently knowing what was coming, and he was killed. His body was found much later, and accounts describe his hands having been severed, a grim message about the hand that had shaken the agents and the hand that had vouched for him. The man who had trusted Donnie Brasco died for that trust, mutilated as a warning to anyone who might ever vouch carelessly again. Lefty Ruggiero faced the same fate. As Brasco's original sponsor, he was also marked for death once the truth came out, and by various accounts, he was summoned in the same period that claimed Sonny Black. What saved him was the government. The FBI arrested Lefty before the mafia could kill him, pulling him into custody and out of reach of the men who had been waiting to execute him. He went to prison rather than to a grave, and he died years later of cancer while still serving his sentence. The agent he had mentored lived under a $500,000 bounty for years afterward, while the man who had vouched for that agent lost his freedom and very nearly his life. The reach of it extended even further. Anthony Mira, the mobster who had first introduced Brasco into that world, was himself murdered in the aftermath, killed by his own people because he too bore responsibility for having brought the agent in. A single undercover operation, run by one man, ended with multiple mobsters dead or imprisoned, not for their own crimes against the government, but for the simple fact that they had believed in Donnie Brasco. The organization did not distinguish between a man who deceived it and the men who had unknowingly opened the door for him. All of them had failed in their duty to protect the family, and all of them paid. The same logic of retaliation followed the cooperators who testified openly. After Sammy Gravano helped convict John Gotti and dozens of others, the desire for revenge did not fade with Gotti's imprisonment. Years later, Gotti's own brother was convicted of taking part in a plot to have Gravano killed in retaliation for his testimony. The man who had turned was protected and hidden, but the impulse to punish him reached on for years, touching the people around the case long after the trials had ended. Cooperation did not end the violence. It redirected it, often toward people who had little to do with the original decision to talk. This is the dimension of the informant story that Goodfellas leaves almost entirely outside the frame. The film treats betrayal as a contained event, a single man's decision, with consequences that fall mainly on himself. Henry Hill cooperates, loses his glamorous life, and ends up in a dull suburb complaining about the food. The damage in the film is essentially his own. The record shows something far more destructive. An informant's existence detonated outward, and the blast caught the men who had trusted him, sponsored him, and brought him into the family. Sonny Black did nothing to the government. He simply believed in a man who turned out to be an agent, and he was executed and mutilated for it. Lefty did nothing but mentor that same man, and he lost his freedom. Anthony Mira did nothing but make an introduction, and he was murdered for it. The Mafia's code held every member responsible for the people he vouched for, and so the price of a single informant was rarely paid by the informant alone. It was paid by the network of trust around him, by the men who had extended their word on his behalf, by people who never sat down with the government and never would have. The film follows its one informant home and shows the audience his diminished life. It never follows the bodies of the men who had trusted him, the ones who learned too late what their trust had cost. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The men who vouched for informants paid in blood and prison for trusting the wrong people, a cost the film never followed. The strangest corruption of all, though, ran in the other direction, when the federal handlers meant to control these informants crossed the line themselves and became part of the killing. Section 9. When the handlers went bad. The whole logic of running an informant rested on a clear division of roles. The handler was the professional, the controlled party, the representative of the law who used a criminal as a tool while remaining apart from the criminal's world. The informant was the asset, valuable but never trusted, a source to be managed and contained. As long as that division held, the arrangement could be defended as a necessary, if unpleasant tactic in a difficult fight. The record of the informant system shows that the division did not always hold, and that the handlers meant to control these men sometimes crossed the line and became part of the very thing they were supposed to be dismantling. The relationship between Gregory Scarpa and his handler shows how far that line could move. Lindley DeVecchio, the supervisory agent who brought Scarpa back into the fold in 1980, did not keep the careful distance the role demanded. He dined at the gangster's home, accepted his hospitality, and developed a closeness with him that unsettled other agents who watched it form. Across more than a decade, Scarpa fed information to DeVecchio while continuing to kill, and during the Colombo family war of the early 1990s, the suspicion arose that information had also been flowing in the other direction. Allegations held that DeVecchio had passed Scarpa confidential details about his enemies, intelligence that helped the capo locate and murder men on the rival side of the conflict. If true, it meant the government's own agent had become a weapon in a mob war, helping one of the deadliest killers in New York find his targets. Those allegations eventually reached a courtroom. In 2006, prosecutors in Brooklyn charged DeVecchio with involvement in 4 murders, accusing him of having aided Scarpa by feeding him information that led to the killings. It was an extraordinary moment. A former FBI supervisor facing murder charges over his handling of an informant. The case did not survive. In 2007, it collapsed when the credibility of a central witness fell apart, after old recordings surfaced that contradicted the account she gave on the stand. The charges were dismissed, and DeVecchio maintained that he had done nothing wrong. What the case left behind, regardless of its legal outcome, was a detailed and disturbing public record of how tangled the relationship between a handler and a killer could become, and how difficult it was to say with certainty where the Bureau's work ended and Scarpa's murders began. The most damaging example of a corrupted handler came not from New York, but from Boston, and it left no ambiguity at all. There, the FBI had recruited violent organized crime figures as top echelon informants, among them a gangster who would become one of the most notorious criminals in the country. The agent who handled that relationship protected his sources far beyond any legitimate limit. He shielded them from investigation, and on at least one occasion he passed along information that identified a man as a potential witness against them, a man who was then murdered. The agent was eventually prosecuted and convicted, first on federal racketeering charges, and later for his role in a killing that his protected informants carried out. He went to prison, a federal agent convicted in connection with the crimes of the men he was supposed to be using against the Diem Mafia. The Boston scandal exposed the deeper cost of the entire approach. Over the years, victims and their families brought lawsuits against the government, totaling more than $1 billion, arguing that crimes committed by protected informants could be traced back to the Bureau's decision to shield them. The agents who had welcomed these informants and praised their handlers had, in some cases, allowed killers to keep killing because the intelligence they provided was considered too valuable to lose. The machine, built to penetrate organized crime, had, in those offices, become complicit in the violence it was meant to stop. The reason this kind of corruption recurred was built into the structure of the program itself. An informant was valuable only as long as he kept producing, and producing meant remaining active inside the criminal world, which meant continuing to commit crimes. A handler whose career advanced on the strength of his source had a powerful incentive to keep that source operating and out of prison. Over years of close contact, the professional distance could erode into something closer to partnership. Gifts and cash were alleged to have passed in some of these relationships. Loyalty that should have run only toward the law began, in certain cases, to run toward the informant instead. The man who was supposed to be the clean side of the arrangement became invested in the survival and success of a criminal, and the criminal learned to use his handler as effectively as the handler used him. This is a part of the story that Goodfellas has no room for, because the film keeps law enforcement almost entirely faceless. The agents who appear are background figures, an external force closing in from outside the world of the film, clean and impersonal and inevitable. The audience is never invited to consider that the people running the informants might themselves be compromised, that the line between the government and the gangsters could blur to the point of disappearing. The real record dissolves that clean division. It shows handlers dining in the homes of killers, passing them information, shielding them from prosecution, and, in the worst cases, becoming participants in murder. The film's neat boundary between the cops and the criminals was, in the actual history of the informant system, one of the first things to break down. What all of these threads finally produced, taken together, was the slow destruction of the one thing the mafia had counted on above everything else: the code of silence. The rule that had let the organization survive for generations was being eaten away from every direction at once, and by the time the film was made, it was already closer to dead than anyone watching would have guessed. The handlers meant to control the informants sometimes became part of the killing, dissolving the clean line the film draws between the law and the mob. All of these forces together, the turncoats and the programs and the corrupted agents, were quietly destroying the one rule the mafia could not survive without, and the full reckoning of that collapse is where this account finally ends. Section 10. The Code That Was Already Dead. By the time Goodfellas reached theaters in 1990, the world it depicted with such warmth was already in its final decline, and the single force, doing more than any other to destroy it, was the one the film barely acknowledged. The mafia had been built on omerta, the rule of silence, the shared understanding that no member would ever speak to the government, no matter the cost. That rule was the foundation beneath everything else, the thing that made the organization possible. Generations of men had held to it, and the families had survived because they had. What the informant stories assembled across this account reveal is that the foundation had been crumbling for decades, eaten away from every direction at once, long before the film ever asked its audience to mourn the world it portrayed. The collapse can be traced as a sequence. In 1963, Joe Valachi sat in front of Senate cameras and became the first made man to break the silence in public, proving that the wall could be breached. Around the same time, the FBI launched the program designed to grow informants on purpose, deep inside the families, and across the following years it cultivated sources at every level. One of those sources, Gregory Scarpa, fed the government information for roughly 30 years, while remaining one of the deadliest men in New York, which meant that for 3 decades, a capo at the center of a major family was a federal informant the entire time. In the second half of the 1970s, Joseph Pistone proved that the Bureau could go further still and place its own agent inside a family for years, close enough to be considered for membership. Each of these developments chipped away at the idea that the organization was sealed and impenetrable. Then came the breaking point. In 1991, Sammy Gravano, the underboss of the most prominent family in the country, sat down with the government and traded everything he knew for his freedom. His defection did more than convict John Gotti. It told every wise guy in America that the code was now optional, even at the very top, that a man could take part in 19 murders and walk free in a handful of years if he was willing to talk. After Gravano, the silence stopped being sacred. A wave of members followed his example, each cooperator producing cases that sent more men to prison, and each man facing a long sentence looking at Gravano's deal and drawing the obvious conclusion: The code that had held for generations became, almost overnight, a relic that only fools still died for. The informants did their work alongside a legal weapon designed to use what they provided. The racketeering law that prosecutors deployed against the families through the 1980s allowed the government to put entire leadership structures on trial, and the testimony of cooperating insiders was what brought those cases to life. The combination proved overwhelming. The men at the top, who had operated for decades with a confidence built on the assumption that no one beneath them would ever talk, found that assumption dissolving underneath them. The organization had no defense against its own people, because its entire survival had depended on the certainty that its own people would stay silent, and that certainty was gone. This is the story standing just outside the frame of Goodfellas, the story the film refused to show. The film presents omerta as a living thing, a real and binding code that Henry Hill violates in a singular act of desperate betrayal at the end of his story. It treats his cooperation as the breaking of something whole. The record shows that the thing was already broken, riddled with informants from top to bottom, honeycombed by decades of men who had quietly crossed the line while still attending the dinners and collecting the tribute. Hill was not the man who broke the code. He was one more name on a long list, joining a betrayal that had been unfolding for a generation before he ever signed his agreement. The film could only ever show one man in a bathrobe, because it could only ever see what Henry Hill saw. His knowledge ended in 1980, and so the film ends there too, with his diminished suburban life framed as the close of the whole story. The full ledger of the informant world was far larger than anything Hill could have known from his seat at the table. It held Valachi sitting before the Senate 17 years earlier. It held a federal program quietly turning made men into sources. It held a killer protected by the Bureau for 30 years, an agent who lived as a wise guy and nearly became one, an underboss who detonated the entire code, a witness program that erased the people it saved, a chain of men murdered for vouching, and handlers who became part of the killing they were meant to stop. None of it fit inside one man's affectionate memory, and so none of it made the film. What the informant stories finally reveal is that the world Goodfellas mourns was never as solid as it appears on screen. The Brotherhood was seeded with traitors. The silence was a surface stretched over a structure full of holes. The loyalty the film treats as real was, in the actual record, a thing that men sold for reduced sentences and new identities. Whenever the calculation turned against them, the film chose to show the warmth and to let the audience feel the loss of it. The record shows an organization that was already dissolving from within, betrayed not by one desperate associate in a bathrobe, but by a steady procession of insiders who had been talking to the government for 30 years, before the cameras ever rolled. That procession is the true dark side of the story the film told, the part it sped past, the part it declined to enter. The men who informed were everywhere, and they had been there all along. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.